This is the fifth of the series about the Xeris Tachvatat, about the Cossack uprising and the Jews. And I've done as much as time will permit in terms of the actual facts. Now let's look at the aftermath. That's what I promised to do. I have a very intelligent audience this particular round of lectures. I'm serious, because I got a lot of very good questions, either person or in emails, which were very pertinent historically to what we've been talking about, and not some of the usual blather. So somebody asked me last week, and it's perfectly fair, what's going on in general at this time, to give her and some other people an idea of the general trend in Europe. Now, I'm going to take a minute to do that, or so, because it will be of a certain amount of interest in the sense of situating the events that we're talking about in their proper context, but I don't want to overdo that. So, everything we spoke about, I direct your attention to the map over here in 1648. This is what Europe looked like, roughly speaking, at that time. As you can see, there aren't that many countries, but there are, some big ones. Poland was big at that time. Russia, as you see, was big. Ottoman Empire was big. And even some of your European states are kind of large. And then you have all these little hundreds of states, which are called Germany or the Holy Roman Empire at that time. Now, I don't want to take you on a tour of the geography of Europe in 1648. I just want to make the following point. If you ask me what's going on during 1648 in Europe, I'll give a very general answer, and that is that you divide European history up to 1815 and after. And by that I mean, up to 1815, there were constant wars all the time, all over the place. You can't keep track of them. If I even told you now, that'd be weird that I can memorize this stuff. There are hundreds of conflicts going on forever in Europe. You really want to go down the line? Notice how many wars was England involved in the 1600s. Well, the Civil War in the 1640s. Before that, they had some Irish campaigns. Then, they wanted to get involved in the 30 Years' War, and that didn't work out exactly, but the King James had to fight the Scots. You see what I'm saying? It gets crazy. Then you have the Oliver Cromwell Wars, and then afterwards you get England involved. Every few years there's another war. And England was relatively uninvolved. Talk about France. Talk about the Germans or the Austrians or whoever. It becomes crazy. That was typical. Until before 1815, war was one continuous thing, interrupted by peace. Ever since 1815, the last 200 years, it's the opposite. Europe switched to being at peace. Now, there are two gigantic exceptions. I understand that. World War I and World War II. We're the last people to, underplay and underestimate the importance of that. But they are. Think about what I'm saying. Since 1815 till today, England, France, Germany, these places have been at war basically once, or twice. And if you're France and Germany, 3 times. That's very little. The Europeans eventually got it. There are a couple of small wars that pop up from time to time in Europe, but only a couple. As we sit here today or stand, there's a couple of military wars going on in the Balkans and places that many of us don't even know where they are, in Kosovo and who knows where, Bosnia and places like that. I always like to ask this, who can tell me the capital of Macedonia? It's not the old map that you and I knew when we were kids. The point is that Europe changed. But at the time we're speaking about in the Xeris Tachvatat, think of how many wars Poland got into in the small period of time that I'm talking to you. Well, it's the wars against the Ukrainians and against the Tatars, and then the Ottoman Turks get into it, and then Russia gets into it, as I described last time, and then Sweden, and then Prussia. It goes crazy. And that was life. And so that's how you made money. That's what you needed to know about if you were in business. Where does a war go on at this particular time or elsewhere? Somewhere in Europe there's always a war going on. Jews had to know how to maneuver in between that kind of reality. Jews generally were not soldiers, but they lived in lands in which are going to be traversed by soldiers. As a Gatus, it's not the USA that you and I know and love today, in which we never see soldiers. It's a country that's been at peace. Baltimore hasn't been invaded, as far as I can recall, since the War of 1812, when Star Spangled Banner. That's interesting. This is not the reality that these people were used to at that time. The communities that lived in the Ukraine or in other parts of Poland knew there were always wars going on somewhere. The only thing is they don't want it to happen to them. And generally speaking, as I tried to indicate, Poland in the good old days, from our point of view, which is from the time the Jews came there in the 1500s, let's say, and the early 1600s, was powerful enough once upon a time that all the battles that the Poles fought were in the borders, in the frontier areas, you know what I'm saying? Over here and up there and these kind of places against the Swedes and the Turks. And so if you lived like most Jews did in Krakow or Lublin or Lemberg or Posen or Vilna, they were very far away from the battle lines. That's what you call in Europe a zone of peace. Right? If the war isn't, within 20 miles of your house or 30 miles of your house, you live in a peaceful zone. So it's just, I mention that, to give you some kind of a grounding or a context. 1648 was the end of the 30 Years' War, when over here, these are the German states, they all shechted each other. A wiped out B, and then B wiped out A. The Catholics did it to the Protestants did to the Catholics so successfully that when the 30 Years' War was over, the Catholic Church had to give a heter that you can do bigamy because of underpopulation. Okay? That's when Germany came close to wiping itself out, which is an interesting prospect. There were constant other wars. In 1649 is when Oliver Cromwell chopped off the head of King Charles I. So things were going on everywhere. But we're going to focus here, obviously, on the experience of the largest and most important Jewish community anywhere, which, I repeat, outnumbered. I think even at that time, and certainly a little bit later, outnumbered all the other Jews in the world put together. And so what happens in the Zeros Tach V'Tat is not simply of significance for a Jewish community, which it is, but and not only for us, because most of us are probably descendants from those people, which we are, but because it affected the largest community anywhere. Now, I can just tell you that from the internal Jewish point of view, not only was a shock, the 1648 was supposed to be when the Mashiach comes, because the 1600s was a big era of Kabbalah. And one of the aspects of Kabbalah, not the only one, is you're very into calculating when Mashiach's coming and things like this. And Zos, the year Taf Ches, is 1648, is also equal to Taf Zayin Aleph. Isn't that right? Zos. Bezos Yovo Aron El HaKodesh. You can already start to hear the drushes that were preached once upon a time. When will we come to the Kodesh HaKadoshim? Meaning, when's the Mashiach coming? And indeed, you find in the writings of people who lived at that time, wrote about, like the Shach and others we'll talk about, that they said, wait a minute, this is the opposite of what it was supposed to be. It was supposed to be the time of the good, of the Mashiach. And you may be certain that many people in Jews at that time, obviously if you lived in Eastern Europe, this is clearly the apocalyptic, pre-Messianic wars. World War III, that you learn about in places like the Book of Daniel, that the Ikfis and Mashiach, the Chevle Leda, the coming of Mashiach is accompanied by the most horrible catastrophes. Read the book of Daniel, and we saw that it really happens, that they were convinced, but of course they were wrong. So the year 1640 was a very important year in the Jewish reckoning, but of course it didn't turn out the way it was. In terms of, someone asked me what was going on in the Jewish culture at that time. This is the period of all the people in the Shulchan Aruch. The Shach, the Bach, the Taz, the Tosfos Yontif, all the big rabbis you heard about once upon a time, because as I said before, the civilization of the Jews in Poland had been developing more and more richly for close to 150 years, actually for 150 years at that time. What I talked about a couple of sessions ago, just keep it going generation after generation. So all through the 1500s and into the 1600s, you had the kind of society that we read about in the Yevei Metzula, and even if there were social issues and other problems involved in there certainly were very, strident social critics from within the Jewish community of the problems, but they were clearly a very, very impressive culture and civilization that got more and more intensive. The poster boy for what I'm talking about during the period of the 1640s and all that is the Shach, Shabsi Cohen, who was born a genius and ends up being marrying somebody very rich in Vilna and being a dayan there and writing the Shach on Yerodei. If anybody understands what that is, when he's 18, 19, 20 years old. In other words, you had this cultivation of geniuses running around. And these are extremely important works of Jewish law. This was a golden era of the writing of Jewish law codes because it was a golden era of Jewish autonomy. The Jews in the kingdoms of Poland were given very large autonomous powers by the rulers, as long as it's Jew on Jew. Right? And there were a lot of Jew on Jew fights. And what I'm trying to say is that the crown or the local magnates recognized the authorities of the Beis Din. They could overturn it what they felt like it, but usually it wasn't in their interest to do so. And therefore, it's like Spain back in the 1300s. You had a highly developed Jewish autonomous system, which really mirrored the Polish one. If the Poles had courts, the Jews had courts. If the Poles had what they call local diets, or we'd say today state legislatures, the Jews developed the exact model of that, what they call the VODs. And if the local state legislatures get together in a regional legislature, which they used to do in Poland, then the Jews did the same thing, and there would be the Vod Haaretz. And if all the regional legislatures get together in one national legislature, as they do, first in Krakow and then in Warsaw, then the Jews will do the same thing, the Vod Arba Arotzos. They're copying it. So who are the people that run these kinds of things? Rich, powerful, learned, a highly elitist kind of a society which functioned the same way the Poles did. So it was a period where the Rabbinical culture, which that was the middle and high culture, was powerfully flourishing. And you can read the biographies of each and every one of these people. If anybody's interested, you just take a look at the Art Scroll or early Ahronim or one of those books and find what happened to each one when it hits 1648 or 1650 or thereabouts, and then you see a turn in their fortune. For example, the Shach, as I mentioned before, was this big rabbi. He only lived to be 40. Right? He wrote these very seminal works and died very young, relatively speaking. And he's in Vilna. Well, you were with me these last couple of lectures. The fighting was mostly over here. But then it really got out of hand. And eventually Khmelnytsky calls in the Russians, doesn't he? After the Tatars betray him and hook up with the Turks, because the Tatars are afraid the Russians getting too strong. If you're confused, that's my point. So when the Russian army comes in here in 1655, all the way up here, and burned Vilna for 17 days, killed 45,000 people, would torture every dude to get their hands on, and anybody had to flee. So somebody like the Shah, who's the young guy, has to run away, and eventually ends up in another country, in Moravia, which is in the Austrian Empire. And many of the rabbis, the big shots at that time, the Taz, the Shach, and all these other people, either they had to go this way and locate themselves in some part of Poland that was relatively less attacked, and there weren't many places like that, or they fled and had to go to other countries. So there was a whole wave of big rabbi types and other regular Jews who end up going to Austria, places like Vienna and Prague, and Moravia and things of this nature. Some, like the Vilna Gaon's a relative, ends up going like that to Amsterdam. And there we have the beginning of the Ashkenazic Jewish community in Amsterdam. Everybody's familiar with the Sephardic Jewish community there, the Spanish-Portuguese one, Menashe ben Israel, Spinoza if you want, and all those, and they were there first. But on the other hand, they turned out to be a bunch of Polish Jews that come there. Well, what the heck are Polish Jews doing all the way over in Amsterdam? The answer is, if you're living in the 1640s and 50s, that's an easy question to answer. So it generates its own wave of hard luck stories and what we would call today people having to run away from Holocaust type situations. So obviously it discombobulated the entire Jewish world. Now, internally, this is the fascinating part. Here we are before Tisha B'Av. And the question that people have already asked me, correctly so, is, how did the Jews react to this internally? And the answer is, we're dealing with the 1600s, people a lot more from. Internally. It was an era where skepticism did not reign. Everybody's a believer, with the rarest of exceptions, Jews and Christians. And so, that being the case, we have sinned, God is punishing us. That's how you immediately figure it out. What did not happen at that time, what happened in the 20th century after the Holocaust, when significant Jewish cultural figures who were already alienated from religious tradition, who had undergone a process of secularization, were nevertheless, and have nevertheless been trying to cope with the magnitude of the Holocaust, this unbelievably horrible, evil thing, which seems to have been focused by somebody at the Jews, but there's nobody out there because they don't believe in God, so what did happen? And once you look for impersonal forces, so it becomes hard to find meaning in it, and therefore we struggle with this ever since then. I always call it the Elie Wiesel phenomenon. But there weren't Elie Wiesels in the 1600s. That's my point. And so, for example, if you take a look at the book I've been using, which is the classic description of it, the Yevei Metsula, at the very, very end, he's writing this in 1651, I believe, or so. So the war is still going on. If you were here last time, this stuff continued pretty much for 20 years, off and on. Remember, Khmelnytsky brought in the Russians eventually, then the Swedes came in, then the Tartars renewed the fighting, so you didn't have exactly the kinds of dramatic massacres that we described earlier, but you had undramatic massacres. What do you care? Massacre is a massacre. And so he says, V'yad hayom hazeh, yesh v'mdinas Poland, cherev v'rov v'dever godel b'chol haaretz. Till this time, this is 2-3 years later, there is going throughout the kingdom of Poland, cherev v'rov, the sword, and famine, and terrible plagues, in other words, epidemics, v'tzoros achronos mashachas rishonos, and the new misfortunes that we encounter every day make us forget what happened last year because it's now here. And every day is worse than the preceding day. It's fulfilling what it says in the Tochacha, where it says, you'll say, when it's morning, I say, I can't wait till the day's over, and when night is, I can't wait till tomorrow morning. Notice the present will always be unbearable. So he's clearly doing what all the Jews did at that time, which is locating this within the Tochacha. You understand? We Jews, this is Tisha B'Av. In 2 days from now it's Tisha B'Av. Tisha B'Av is all about taking the misfortunes, which are historical facts, and locating them within a specific Jewish context. It's the context of the Bible, which is that Moshe Rabbeinu says, you're going to do sins, this will happen to you. And so and he describes there all the kind of things that they undertook, and they didn't have a secular attitude to say, well, that's not true, and then they could find some other reason. They said, this is it. And so, and he quotes extensively from the Torah that says that Moshe Rabbeinu warns them that even other things that I haven't described in here will befall you. And he said that certainly happened to us. So he concludes his chronicle by saying, what can we say? How can we justify it? So we know we're sinners. What can we complain to God about? If we would make the bold claim that we haven't sinned, everybody knows that's not true. He's one of the people that's going through this in 1651. God knows what's going on over here. Because after all, would God ever do anything that wasn't just? So you see the revolution in attitudes of modernity versus pre-modernity over here. But then he also finds, as we do in Tisha B'Av, strands within the Torah and within the Torah tradition to argue the other way around. That suffering doesn't necessarily mean that God is punishing someone because he doesn't like them. We have a concept that God punishes those he loves and holds them to a tougher standard. Here we are with Nadav and Avihu. That's what we're talking about. Were they punished, or was their death of Nadav and Avihu a sign of their great sanctity and righteousness? This whole thing goes back and forth. He's deploying it in trying to deal with what happened to this Holocaust in 1648. Again, he quotes from various sources which say the exact same thing, that Nadav and Avihu and people like that, that by striking the righteous for minor infractions, you see the justice of God brought forth in its full majesty. And there's no trouble saying that. And we have a concept also of a certain vicarious punishment. And here you have what Chana Wasserman said when he was shot. He said, we're dying for the American Jews. Remember such an idea? So there's this kind of thing. That's how he ends the book. He doesn't end it on a glorious note because he was living right in the middle of these tragedies. So there's no question that the overall theme of the Jews at that time was not one of this kind of psychological eating away that we found in the post-Holocaust period. I mean, my parents went through a war. I know this all firsthand. So, the idea of why did this happen and all that. We know why it happened. It's an attitude which lets you move on with life, and that certainly was very powerful theme at that time. Wait a second. He says, it's also true that mipnei chataenu means for our sins. He speaks about it in very general terms. But it's also true, as we see nowadays, that Bernie was alluding to, I think, that there's always those people who want to say, if it was due to our sins, we can find which sins they were. There are people today that will tell you what were the sins of the Holocaust or something, right? Well, at that time it's the same thing. And so the rabbis in Poland had different opinions about this. And it boils down to what do you call the sin du jour. You see? What is the big Avera? Because no one claimed, at least as far as I can tell, that they knew from heaven what the reason is. Well, yes and no. One of the martyrs that I mentioned last week was Rav Shimshon Oster-Polier, very famous Makubal, who was held in such esteem that he was, held like the Arizal or something, that, he really did get nevuah of a certain type. Whether he was told by a Maggid or some other heavenly force, it doesn't matter how you call it, but they don't use the word nevuah, but that's what it boils down to. You have a direct phone line upstairs. And they said, it's not written, but they said, and that's the trouble, it goes by rumors, that he said that it was talking in shul. Right? Which was a big theme picked up by the Tosas Yontiv, who was one of the big rabbis in Poland at that particular time. The Tosas Yontiv was a German rabbi who had moved 20 years earlier from Germany, where things are really tough, to Poland. I mean, he had been in Prague and gotten in trouble with the local Balabatim because he wanted to reform the Jewish tax system because it favored the rich over the poor. Surprise, surprise. And so he had to hightail it into Poland, where he also got in trouble because he said that the big sins that we have today are two in number, and eventually conflated them for the purpose of assigning the fault of the Holocaust. To put it in plain English, one problem is talking in shul. The other problem is corrupt rabbis. Right? The Beis Dins and the Rabbanim and all this, it's a bought office. It's an elite system where it's old boy network. It's, everybody puts in their relatives and their in-laws or something like that, son-in-law. And you know how it goes. The result was like this. One group said, it's your fault. The other group said, it's your fault. So, as is famous, and we have here in the shul, somebody gave many years ago, over there where I'm pointing with my pointer, is the famous Mishaberach that they attribute. We're not 100% sure if it's from him, but they attribute to the Tosas Yontiv in the Mishaberach for not talking in shul. And even though it'll seem to some people like a little thing, it's a big thing. It's a big avera. It's not a little avera. It has to do in general with the idea of people not feeling that a Beis HaKnesses is a Malkum Kaddish. They feel like they can, act however they want. And the Jews at that time had no trouble assigning all these horrors that I described to you in great detail to things like that. Right? Notice he said, these are the sins of the generations. But that's not the only one. One of the famous preachers at that time in Poland, is not so well known today, was Rav Bracha Berach. It was actually a father and a son. And these two guys were like, Billy Graham. It was, fire and brimstone. But they were very strident social critics. Everybody loved to hear him and everybody hated to hear him. The reason they loved to hear him, they're fantastic speakers. The reason they hated to hear him was because he told like it was. You understand? And by the time he got finished, all the rich people and all the powerful and all the others in the audience were like things. So he's always, on the move. He never could stay in a place at one time. It was too unpopular, even though they invited him back later on. And he says, I found it somewhere, that he lists in his speeches, he said, he lives right through this period. He says, you know why all this Holocaust happened? You got the following averas: breeding of pigs. So that means that, Jews, that's right. Listen, I told you, all these guys were involved in the economy over here in the Ukraine. that means that these Jewish agents ran hundreds of miles sometimes, full of farms and peasants and whole provinces. And what can I tell you? Money's money, and it is what it is. So he said, breeding of pigs, Machal Shabbos, by terms at that time, davening without kavanah, false interpretations of the Torah by darshanim. This is a darshan speaking. I mean, that's quite a punishment for that. The sale of rabbinical positions even to those qualified, meaning that the way it went was the position of the communal rabbi was bought. This eventually just became the way it was imposed. There was no way you could get around it. After a while, the local lords, the magnates who ruled the area, always insisted that they be paid off if anybody's going to be the rabbis. Then it becomes a question of which side can come up with the more money, and you can imagine how dirty that gets. It's very famous. And Rabbi Yonasan Eibshitz, 100 years later, was offered to be the Rav in Krakow, a position he was born there, but he didn't take the job. They told him, he says, they write this. They say, we've already bribed the local duke. You don't have to worry about all that. It's been taken care of. That's how much we hold of you. You understand? And there was, I forget who, it shows how rare it was, some rabbi who were a safer in the 1700s in Poland, and he says, you won't believe this. I got the job without paying a penny, and nobody had to be bribed, everything like this. It's everybody's wondering how it happened. This is the result of a society in which, all the Jews everywhere are under the rule of these magnates, and therefore it's money, money, money. The only reason they're allowed there is for the money. And so the rabbinate becomes part of that. The luxurious clothing, and these are only some of the sins that were the causes. And he called for the immediate tikkun of all these terrible sins. So, wow. Point is, nobody knew exactly. They're all looking for what they considered the sins of the time. And today, people would be offended, I would, if they say, I know what a Holocaust happened because people did this, and in Russia or Poland or Germany or something like that. I consider that to be crazy. But they didn't at that time. Right? The people we're speaking to had a different sensibility, and therefore their reaction to this Holocaust was quite different than the ones that we're seeing over here. So, as I say, you didn't have the Elie Wiesel kind of attitude, except a little bit. When I say a little bit, you find the Shach of all people, who was the biggest rabbi at that time, or one of the biggest, among other things, wrote a long poem describing in gruesome detail, paralleling what I've read you before. It's called the Megillas Eifa. I'm not going to read it because it's too long. Where he goes for page after page, I think about 15 pages or so, of a long poem, which rhymes, in which he goes through all these kinds of gzeras that we were talking about over here. I mean, just to give you the shortest, brief passage of it. He says, Kama me'as tova b'mayim b'chol me'yisurim kashim. He talks about the people who were drowned by the enemy in the water and all kind of terrible tortures. Ubei'sei knesel fnei aron kodesh hakadoshim shachtu b'chalafas hamisham b'chazar meshamoshem, and how they went in front of the base, right over here, in front of the Aron Kodesh, and they shechted the chazan and the choirs. So you see, they used to have choirs at that time, and the shamoshim, and this and this and this. So see, called Sifrei Torah Sishon Chadoshim, and they pulled out wherever they went all the Sefer Torahs out of the Aron Kodesh. And they ripped them to shreds and trampled on them for man animals, the horses and cavalrymen. And made them into shoes and sandals. And they, on purpose, out of anger, took the Hebrew books and the Sefer Torahs and turned the Ksav, the writing, onto the floor so they could stamp one over here. No, there was a lot of atavistic kind of animal-like hatred that they displayed, in addition to killing people and doing all the other types of things. So he goes in all these kinds of details. People like the Shach echo a little bit what you find in some of the keynotes that we're about to recite on Tisha B'Av, in which you have, as what I call this Elie Wiesel kind of phenomenon, which is, where are you, God? How come this happened? Why'd you let it go? You see? Not a lot, because they're still believers and they're religious Jews. That's an understatement, Shach. But nevertheless, you see the evidence of your eyes and you say, because, listen, we have this tradition, again, that we're going to recite in 2 days, in Judaism, where the 10 martyrs are killed, the 10 great rabbis, Rabbi Akiva and the others, I'm talking about, right? And the angels complain to God. Isn't that right? They say zu Torah v'zu schara. This is a well-known trope, meaning this isn't something that's outside of our tradition. The Malachim are challenging this, and God just says to them, this is Zerahim Elfonai, you just shut up. This is beyond you. So, okay, but we understand that the angels are moved when they see Rabbi Akiva being tortured, so that means we can. And therefore, as I say before, when at a certain limit, you'll find people like the Shach and the Tosas Yontav and people like this of the highest religiosity saying, how could this happen to Poland? All these yeshivas, all these people, how could you, why didn't you stop them? This is what should have happened. They should have opened their Kodesh and been struck with lightning. And none of that happened. So these are the kinds of, as I say, reactions on the religious level that emerge out of here. And for this reason, there will not be, this is a controversial position in the historiographies, I'll try to explain a little bit later. I don't think there really was a long-term psychological trauma of the Polish Jews. They were able to fit it within a certain theological framework, and we know it happened, and now let's move on with life, because that's all you can do. There is nothing else that you can do. Right? That's exactly what I'm going to disagree with. That's exactly where I'm going. That's exactly what I'm going to disagree with. On the other hand, what's interesting is that they wanted to make a Yom HaShoah. That they felt they should do. Or let's put it this way. The Shach, who I repeat, was pretty much, even though he was young, he was in his 20s. He was born in 1622 and he died in 1663. So he was 41 or 40 when he died. So here's somebody who's in his 20s. What's 1640? That would be he's 26 years old when the Xeris Takvatat hits. But by that time he was, as we would say today, a published author. He was already a gigantic gaon and held in the highest renown. And he says over here himself, at the end of this very long poem, he says, Al kain kovati liatzmi l'dorosai levonim v'nei bonim. Therefore, I have established, at least for my kids, for my family. I'm not telling someone else what to do, but I'm telling you what I'm doing in my family. Yom tzom v'tainis ve'evel misik b'kinim. We're going to have a private Yom HaShoah, at least in my family. Okay, a day of mourning and fasting and all that. B'yom chaf l'chodesh Sivan, and I'm picking for my family to do it on the 20th of Sivan. Shebo nitna Torah yakom mipninim. The month of Sivan is the month where the Torah was given. After all, that's the month of Shavuos. But you and I know it's also the month where all these massacres happened in Nemirov and Tolshin and all these other places that we talked about. And it's also when the Crusades hit, and it's also, as you'll see again, V'yatah krua pura'u goyim rabim hamonim monim. And now once again, the Torah has been ripped to shreds, as literally, not only figuratively too, but literally ripped to shreds during this month. This, again, it plays on a well-known theme. Those who will remember from the Kinos, the famous poem of the Maam Rottenberg, Shali Sruf of Eish, where he looks at the burning of the Torah by the church in Paris in, 1244 or so, where he was present, and he says, is this why the Torah was given in the month of Sivan, so it should be burned at that time, so the horrible dissonance between the ideal on the one hand and the reality on the other, is poetically presented. But why does he say, I want to do the Chaf Sivan? This was the day when the massacre started, right? So apparently he knew. And it's also a day that's been bad luck in Jewish history, like Tisha B'Av. It's a day that has repeated bad things happen on the same day. Now this was the day that Nemirov was killed, on the 20th of Sivan. That was the first massacre, unfortunately they were alive, that we spoke about in great detail. That's when the Cossacks pretended to be attacking and got into the city under false flags and all that sort of thing. Now, why was it a day that is, like Tisha B'Av, repeated bad things that have happened in history? Kigam Gzeris Tas Kala Hoisa B'Yomahu Ba'osun Azmanim, because the terrible decree or persecution of 1171, Taf Taf Chuf Lamed Aleph, happened on that day. And V'gam Ki Yom Zeh Lo Yer B'Shabbos Kodesh Shum Panim. And I also calculated in the calendar, Chav Sivan never falls out on a Saturday. So you won't have to worry about that. based on the calendar. And therefore I wrote all these slichos. So what does that mean? The 20th of Sivan was a day of a famous anti-Semitic incident in France in the time of the Rabbeinu Tam and the Bali Tosus in 1170. It's actually one of the very first blood libels. The basic facts go like this. On the testimony of a Christian servant of the mayor, a Judeophobe, the Jews of Blois, as you say, in France, Jews of Blois were accused of having crucified a Christian child for Pesach and having thrown the body into the river. Now, at that time, the Jews in France were like Poland. Generally speaking, things were pretty good in France. This was the period of Rashi and Bali Tosus. Things got real bad in France after 1189, but prior to that, the Jews had it, so to speak, good there. And here, nevertheless, was an exception to that, where Jews are accused of literally the blood libel. The Count Theobald thereupon commanded all the Jews be thrown into prison, with the exception of a certain woman named Pulsalina, from whom he entertained a particular affection. She was this very important and beautiful Jewish businesswoman. At first, the accused hoped to escape by paying a heavy ransom. Indeed, the Count sent a Jew from Chartres to negotiate concerning the price of their acquittal. But then a Catholic priest intervened, beseeching the Count to punish the Jews severely should the accusation be well-founded, if it's borne out in court. Now, how in the Middle Ages, in the 12th century, in medieval France, how do you bear something out in court? As the accused could not be easily convicted, they determined to submit the witness to the water test. Well, you understand what I'm talking about. It's not that his testimony is that good, but at least they'll submit it to one of these medieval to see if God is backing him. The mayor's servant was conveyed to the river and placed in a boat filled with water. But he didn't sink. So the Count and the population were convinced that his statement was true. And consequently, all the members of the Jewish community were condemned to death by fire. When they were brought to the auto de fe, meaning when they were brought to be burned, a priest begged them to embrace Christianity and preserve their lives. But with very few exceptions, they refused, and they all were burned in the flames while chanting Aleinu l'shabech Adonai Kol, which Aleinu l'shabech, of course, says like this: Hey, mispalin l'hevel Rik, mispalin l'Yeshia, that they bow down to Rik, which can be also Jesus. So in other words, these Jews basically died spitting with them. So there was no love lost on either side at that time. Containing fashion but praising one God. And Pulsalina jumped in with them. So you have a tragedy, and the Rabbeinu Tam, who was the leading rabbi in France at that particular time, he wasn't young, he said that this is something unusual. As I told you before, it would be like, God forbid, something else would happen in America, because it wasn't part of the regular culture at that time, as it later on became. And he saw this as some kind of divine punishment, and he said this day should be a fast day. So there's hardly anyone that keeps that up today. There are a few, the Oberlanders, I think. There's a few Jews that still preserve the kinos from 1171. But the Shah, living in 1648, said, I'm not being mechadish anything over here, God forbid. I'm simply saying, look, the massacre at Nemirov took place on the same day as this incident at Blois. That shows that, first of all, it's an unlucky day, and second of all I'm doing is reinforcing a precedent, which somebody like the Rabbeinu Tam, who was one of the greatest rabbis of all time, said it's okay to do it, and so we can do it, and therefore that'll be our Yom HaShoah. Now, what's interesting is, if you know anything about the biography of the Chazon Ish after the Second World War, he was extremely opposed to the idea of a Yom HaShoah. That's the reason why, until recently, even on Tisha B'Av, there was never any mention of the Holocaust. You and I have lived through the period. I've actually maybe paid a tiny part in it of, changing that slightly, that they add now one or sometimes two keynotes at the very end of the keynotes about the Holocaust. But broadly speaking, I'm sure anyone my age knows what I'm talking about. Years ago when we were younger, you went to Shul and Tishu, you sat down, you said the keynotes, you knew what you're saying, you didn't know what you're saying. They have to do with things happened long ago, and World War II had nothing to do with it whatsoever. Now, in the Art Scroll biography here of the Chazon Ish, a very interesting passage, which you'll understand now in light, I hope, of what I've been speaking about. And it goes like this. After the Holocaust, a number of Rabbanim in the Holy Land wanted to establish a new day of fasting and mourning for the horrors of World War II. Rav Herzog, for example, and others, they said, listen, obviously the Shoah seems at least to outweigh anything that's come down the line. 6 million people under in the Hitlerian conditions. That unfortunately, that makes this look like nothing, right? So, do we have no ritual commemoration for it in the Jewish calendar? But the Chazon Ish employed various means in ensuring that this would not happen. It did not come about. He was opposed to it. He was especially concerned that no bona fide Torah leader endorsed the idea. So, if the Israeli government wants to make a Yom HaShoah, if the Associated Jewish Charities wants to do something, but we shouldn't. Now, the Chazon Ish explained his opposition to Rabbi Binyamin Mendelssohn of Commemoration. Some of us remember that's the Haredi kibbutz, where he says that, quote, the sufferings which our people have recently endured was l'mayla min hateva, was above nature, meaning the Shoah is in a class by itself. This and other things, the Crusades, whatever you want, the Inquisition, they're a certain pattern. The Shoah is the Chazon Ish is in a thing by itself. There are those whose understanding tells them to establish the fast, but they're wrong. Only Nevi'im, only prophets, have the ability to proclaim fast days, and we do not. So Rabbi Mendelssohn, I'll say it again, he's the Rav of Commemoration. That's the ultra frum Moshav. So he said, wait a minute, what about Chav Sivan? The Taz, or really it's the Shach, established Chav Sivan as a fast day in commemoration of the Cossack uprisings of 1648-49, even though their destructiveness did not compare with that of the Nazi persecutions. But the Chazon Ish was ready with a refutation. He wrote, firstly, this was not an ordinance to be observed for all generations. There's no mention of it in the commentary of the Taz. And to be perfectly honest with you, we don't really have it as, it's something that spread spontaneously. And as you see up here, very interestingly, the Shach himself, as I just read you, said, this is something I'm doing in my family. If you want to join, you can join, but this is something I feel comfortable with. And so that's a kind of a legalistic argument. So it never was established as Yom HaShoah or Yom Chmelnytsky or something like that, right? Second of all, our spiritual level is not that of the Taz or Shach. For all we know, succeeding generations may be superior to our own. Who are we to establish new ordinances for them? And in a letter, he reiterated his opposition to the proposal, where he said, quote, establishing a fast for all generations, and that's what they wanted to do, apparently, make a tainus out of it, is in the category of a drabonan. All existing fasts go back to the time of the Nevi'im. They are we, a generation that had best be silent about our faults. Be so brazen as to think of establishing something for all generations. Such a proposal bears witness to denial of our sins and a lowly state at a time when we are mired in sin, impoverished and bereft of Torah and mitzvahs. Let us not seek that which is beyond us, but instead let us ponder our paths and do tshuva. That is our obligation, and the weight of the Chazon Ish's opinion put an end to the proposal. So, in other words, he meant, and there's a lot to talk about that, but it's very significant that everybody knew about Chav Sivan and the precedents that we just described, but he was very adamant, obviously for his reasons, that not to mix the two together, that they're not the same thing at all. And as I said before, that's really the reason, as far as I know, that's the reason why connections with the Shoah never were really part of Tisha B'Av even until fairly recently, and now in a sort of modest kind of way. Listen, we're still reeling, people my age, still from the generation, still reeling from the Shoah. We don't have any kind of historical perspective on it, and that was his argument back and forth. Now, the fact, though, is that the Vada Barrosos in Poland felt strongly enough that they recommended, they didn't say you have to, recommend it to the different communities that they should do this, and the Tosis Yontiv, as I said before, who was one of the leaders over there, tried to get this prayer in there. But let's not fool ourselves. People did not stop talking in Shul. Right? The problem with the sale of the rabbinate did not end either. I don't know about these other things that the Zeraberich was talking about. Just because somebody writes in a book about it doesn't mean that people do it. It's a sad reality. As a rabbi of a Shul, I don't have to go into that too much. But it's not that, as a result of this overwhelming shock, people decided to change their patterns of life. Now, that's the internal psychological, religious, and theological reaction to what happened over here. There is a Jewish, broader reaction that's very fascinating to all this, and that has to do with the halachic side and you might say the sociological side. What happens after the 1648 period is over, or maybe a little bit after that? You can just imagine the unbelievable problems of agunas and things of this nature, families torn to bits as a result of these situations. There's the map. Here's the Turkish Empire. Who knows where all these people ended up with? You understand? Who can keep track of all this? We're about to, on Tisha B'Av again, recite the famous story about the son and the daughter of the Kohen Gadol trapped in the room, and they didn't even know who they are. And that's to personify the tragedy of the torn family. There are people, you know and I know, that even today, once in a while, you read in the papers, a brother and a sister are still alive. They'll find themselves from the war. They didn't know they were alive, right? They'll meet somewhere. Now, go back to the 17th century, and you can imagine that until 1648, everything was going great. And then all of a sudden, the uncle's not there, the aunt, the sister, the brother. Where are they? Missing in action. That's sometimes even worse. You follow? Some people had the following fate. They got captured by the Tartars. They got taken to the river, as I'm pointing over here. They eventually got schlepped down into the slave thing, sent over here somewhere, and as we'll see later on, if they were lucky, they got ransomed out. Once you get ransomed out, how do you get back? That's not so easy. I mean, I'm asking you a question. In 1650 or 1660 or 70, how does one walk back, especially for a woman? How do you walk back across Europe? Through repeated war zones. I mean, this is Vildechad. This is the Turkish Empire. Here's one giant war zone. Here's the Tartars versus the Cossacks. I mean, how do you do this? Now, if you have the opportunity, you can do like this. You take a ship, right, whatever, and go back that way. Who can do that? That happens once in a while. You understand what I'm saying? To study the records such as we have of the survivors and of the returnees is to make us understand that for some people, they had experiences like a novel to get back home. And that means that if you lived in Poland in the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, and the 90s of that 1600s, there are always stories out there, aren't there, of people who you thought were dead for many years showing up. And sometimes that's a positive thing, and sometimes it's not. You understand what I'm saying? Sometimes it's not. Sometimes, just to take an obvious example, sometimes the guy's convinced his wife is dead, he remarries, she shows up 25 years later, he's got a whole new family. How do you locate within that? Sometimes you have the reverse situation. There, she was convinced her husband was dead, she got married, and the husband wasn't dead. Then you have even a bigger nightmare from the Agun and the Halacha side. How does one deal with this? There's a classic story, there are many, but there's one very famous story that illustrates the great difficulties of this period, and that is told by Yaakov Emden, who in his famous autobiography, controversial autobiography, the Megillah Sefer, which was published long after his death, and he writes about his ancestors. Now, Yaakov Emden was born around 1700, a little bit later. So he was born not too long after what we're talking about. Let's say 40 years or so, 50 years after the events we're describing. So his father, his grandfather. So you go back 2 generations. That's his family. His grandfather was married to the daughter of a Chashuva rabbi, one of the biggest at that time. This person. Look how fat that saber. The Shar Ephraim was just reprinted. Shalos and Shuvas, Ephraim Cohen. This is like a classic of the old-time Achronim. It's really amazing, and it just came out for the first time, reprinted in a couple hundred years. It's one of the golden oldies. I like that kind of stuff. Now, see, Shar Ephraim was one of the leading rabbis, Dayanim in Vilna. So you can just imagine the elite nature of what we're talking about. And then comes the wars. And then comes 1655, and then comes the Russian army, as I told you before, participating inside of the Cossacks, and they invade Vilna, and the Jews have to flee or get killed, or stuff like that. And so, as he puts it over here, his grandfather, who was very young, who was married to the daughter of the Shiva, rabbi, whatever you want to call it, his grandfather got separated in the melee. Everybody's running away. Here come the Cossacks or the Russians a few miles away. Everybody runs in 5 directions, and in a mob scene, as remember we saw last time, people even let go to the children. So, the horror and the terrors were just indescribable. And so as he puts it over here, he was very young, when they were all fleeing because of the Greek attack. So he got separated from his wife. Now, husband was about 13, 14, 15 years old, and so was the wife. That's what we're talking about in those days. And the bottom line is the wife, who's a girl, she's probably 14, she and the father hold hands, and so they run away together, and the husband gets separated from them. The father and the girl end up here, right? They run away from Vilna, and I forget exactly how they do it, but they end up here in Moravia. And eventually he becomes the rabbi in Budapest, or Ofen at that time, which was still part of the Turkish Empire, as you see. So he's still this person, right? He's a big name. So when he comes to a faraway country, he'll get a job. But what happened to the 13 or 14 or 15-year-old husband? So he disappeared. Well, excuse me, get the wrong page. Here it is. So what exactly happened? He ends up, as I say before, rabbi somewhere. They can't find a husband. Here's what happened. He was seized by a Russian or a Cossack or something, and they said, this is sad, he said, all right, get down and bury your neck, I'm going to chop your head off. And the Jews did it. So the Katzon Latevach Yuval. What can a Jew, especially a 14-year-old kid, what can he do? So you're going to chop his head off. V'chein also. And so this 14-year-old kid did that. He went like that. Pashat Savro L'chev Echad L'shchita. V'limser Nafsh Al Kiddush Hashem. He's going to die. He's not the only one. U'ba'odena Al Birkov L'kabel Amisa B'makas Cherev. It's like a movie. So he says, get on your knees and go, put your neck out or whatever. And while he was on his knees, they probably said the bracha, I guess, Asher Kishem Mitzvos of Yisvano Al Kiddush Hashem. Kimat Parchan Nishmaso, and he was dying of fright. Hine Zem Malach Hashem Nogabo. It's as if he was touched by an angel. A miracle happened. Ki Nosan Hashem Rachmim Belief Hatzor Hatzorer. God put Rachmim in the Cossack, or the Russian. B'chomal Rach Lashonov. And the guy felt sad. Hey, he's a 14-year-old kid. Why should I chop his head off? And so he hit him with the blunt end and not the sharp end. Right? Instead of going like that and chopping his head off, he just gave him a whack. That's his rachman. But still, he didn't kill him. So in other words, he came down like that, but with the sharp side, so he just gave him a sharp whack over here, but didn't kill him. Nichmer rachman also dechifa b'tzad karna shel kli chevtza b'derech bizoyin. He gave him a whack with the blunt end in a contemptuous manner and said, "Kum lech kelev bachor v'lech l'nafshecha." Run, you dog. Run, you dog. Okay, so he ran. And so he didn't get killed. God saved him through a miracle. But this is when all the massacres were going on. So you can just imagine this happened in a street somewhere or whatever, and everywhere around there, shechting people right and left. And so he basically had to play dead, because who knows what the next Cossack is going to do. You get it? And so he's lying there among heaps of bodies, which was typical for Vilna in 1655. And therefore he's out in the heat of all day long, and he in the puddles of water. No, you can just imagine the harsh conditions. At nighttime he has to freeze. Right? So he has to cover himself with some sackcloth. Apparently this was near some kind of a swamp or river, and so you had to eat grass, because the Cossacks still running around for days and days, so you have to just literally pretend to be dead and only eat when nobody's looking and there's no food. And so you eat grass. L'hachis is nafsho. So you drink what's in the puddle of mud. This guy was lucky. This is what happened. What they call lucky in those days. B'matzav halazeh kishmona yomim, 8 days. Atom kol etzama l'dam lavor, until those who were thirsting for blood moved on. Oz baruch al nafsha b'yamim v'pelchsim, and he was able to flee. So in other words, through this crazy set of circumstances, he did not get killed. Now wait a second. But the other people who were there were people who saw the guy chop his head off. You understand what I'm saying? I saw the guy go like that. And so they testified that his wife is an amona, not a guna. That she can get remarried. While he was lying there dead with his head quote unquote chopped off, there were some other Jews that were there also, well meaning, they were also hiding. Of his king, from a distance they saw the whole beheading. They saw how he put his neck down, as I described to you. They saw the Cossacks say, "Here we go, bare your neck, get on your knees, you dog," and all that. So they were sure that he chopped the head off. And when they saw the blade, because they weren't looking close, they saw the blade make contact. So, what do you have to be, a sick dog to watch the whole thing? What more do you need? And they saw the body fall forward. So, anyway, the bottom line is they were absolutely certain that they saw it. So, so when these two guys, who were good fellas, they meant well, when fortune took them that they ended up also schlepped over here in Moravia, in the town of Tribis, and they happened to come across the Shar Ephraim, they said, it's a good fortune we met you. We have sad news to tell you, but you'll actually be happy. We saw your son-in-law get killed. Right? They were able to survive. So they told about it. These guys were kosher Jews. They meant well. It goes to show you how tricky the Aguna business is. You see? The bottom line is they gave testimony. He gave a heter to his daughter. She said, you're 14, you're 15, whatever, you can now go ahead and remarry. And we go by witnesses, and that's all there is. Especially Agunas, we definitely are trying to be as lenient as we can. Now this is the author here, Yaakov Emder, this is great-great-grandmother. You understand? The 14-year-old boy is the father of Chacham Tzvi, if that means who's the father of Yaakov Emder. But the point is that, so this, let's put it this way, she didn't feel right. She didn't want to get married. Something didn't smell right. She was a beautiful girl. But she wouldn't accept Tanchum Malachai. There's a famous expression in the Talmud that, like Yaakov didn't feel for Yosef, you could tell he was really alive. Baal Nu Reho, literally the husband of her youth. She wouldn't get married. And Kiacher Chatzi Shon, and sure enough, 6 months later, Harig Baraglov, the dead guy, showed up in the place. And it was the talk of the town, talk of Klal Yisrael. And the father, the famous Rabbi Shar Ephraim, he said cognitive dissonance. He was happy to see the son-in-law, the rest of it, but he said like this: if I could make a mistake like this, and I said, I'm getting out of this business. I'm never going to get involved with this shaila again, because he saw the Nafsiyata Dishmaya. You understand? For these kind of cases, you don't need a regular rabbi. You need somebody who's like saintly, it's a lachana or something like that, because in addition to the laws, you need Siyata Dishmaya, right? I'm sure we heard all these Moshe Feinstein stories and others about the airplanes or whatever, which is along these lines, which is that a person like this is not going to make a mistake. So he felt that he did. So why am I sharing this? This is a classic story from the historiography. Everybody should know this now. You do. But it speaks of the times, doesn't it? It goes to show you the crazy life that people were living to in these xeris, as they call it, and the wealth of problems that it afforded for the family life. In addition to this, there was simply the big problem of coping with the refugees and trying to do something about the slaves. Here, I can very happily show you over here. This is Bernie Liebtag's master's dissertation. Everybody, I know you're going to laugh what I said is, everybody should read it, but if you're at all interested in this subject, I'm going to persuade him to put it online. And no, he did his homework over here in seeing this is the question that affects us as American Jews. What did we American Jews do after the Holocaust? As I said, I'm not asking a question during the Holocaust. I'm saying, what have we done after the Holocaust? What kind of framework did we create, or did we, for the survivors? This is uncomfortable questions. If you follow the news lately, we're seeing all these unsavory stories, unfortunately, about how the claims conference in Israel, these are ripping off the survivors. It is what it is. So what happened at that time? There were areas in Poland which were relatively less affected. For example, Vilna, at least before the Russians invaded, and then there are other Jewish communities in places like this and like this. How do they deal with the fact that all of a sudden thousands of people show up who are broke? Now, they weren't broke yesterday. They were businessmen and like everyone else, and then they got hit by Khmelnytsky or the Russians or the Tatars or something like this, so it's not their fault, and everybody's broke. And it's really interesting. I don't have the time to do it, but as I say before, anybody who's interested in this subject really ought to take a look at this material that Bernie's collected. They tried to bend the rules as much as they could. They had to obviously make emergency drafts on raising charity, but that's tricky. You have your own budgets. You can't just take all your money that you need for your local community and just give it away. So you have to balance the needs of the refugees with the needs of the present situation. That's always very tough. And so you can make a one-time appeal or a special tax, but you can't do it over and over again. They suspend, whenever possible, the Cheskas HaYishuv, for example, which is that they used to have laws in the old days. This is very common in Ashkenazi Europe, blackball. You can't move in my community because there's already two tailors here. A third one will kill the business. We don't have the room for it. This is the Jewish version of the guild system. Wasn't quite as effective, but the Jews tried to. Rashi versus Rabbeinu Tam debate this back in the Middle Ages, whether you can do such a thing that they just said before. Can't kick somebody out of your community or not let them move in the first place. There's arguments on both sides. There are only so many pizza shops the community can handle, that kind of argument. Or do you take the purely capitalist point of view, which is let the cheapest guy win and the others can starve on the street and who cares about them? This was once upon a time debating. It gives you a little bit of an idea of the terrible financial and economic stress that the other communities were subject to in trying to cope with this totally unprecedented situation. A tzedakah fund is for 2 or 3 or 4 people. It's not for 5,000 to show up. You understand? The frameworks, the institutional infrastructure that was created for handling these imaginary cases was for a relatively small number of people. I mean, how many orphans are there typically? So you have an orphanage, or what goes for an orphanage in the whole kill. They had such things. So, there's a few. No, there's not. Now there's hundreds. And they're here at your door. And what are you supposed to do with them? And you don't have enough food for everybody. But you can't leave a kid just to not to give them no bread, but you don't have to pay. You get what I'm saying? This placed the existing infrastructures for trying to deal with charity under unprecedented strain that they weren't really prepared to handle. There's a certain amount of breakdown. It was all part of the tragedy. The other side of this has to do with the slave market, which got glutted. Ordinarily, as I said before, the Jews created, in their history, particularly in the time we're talking about, in the 1600s, see where I'm doing over here? In the central and eastern Mediterranean, the Sephardim, especially the Spanish Portuguese Jews and the Turkish Jews and that sort of thing, had a really wonderfully organized network of Pidyon Shvuim committees. They used to call it La Sociedad de los Cautivos, the Society of Captives, Pidyon Shvuim. And headquarters was in Venice, where there was a small but very wealthy Sephardic Spanish-Portuguese community, and also a Turkish Sephardic community. And this was where they kept the records. And everybody, look here, here's Sephardic communities here, all over the place. And they're in communication with each other. Cecil Ross has written about this, and there are correspondence. And every time a Jew went on a business trip, he had to pay to this committee, if you're a Sephardic, they had to pay in the committee a certain tax, what we would call today a protection tax, meaning, to keep the kitty having money in it. Why? Pirates. You might get caught on the high seas, and they'll have to ransom you. I've spoken many times here on the phenomenon that piracy was a business, and wherever Jews were captured, all of a sudden on Pidyon Shvuyim. The fact that the pirates know that Jews have such a strong tradition is why the pirates don't kill them. Because usually when the pirates capture a ship, it's not like the movies. They immediately line everybody up in two columns, A and B. A, people will pay for them. B, over the side. If you're the Duke of Medina Sidonia, they won't kill you. It's not because they like you, because you get a ransom. If you're the butler of the Duke of Medina Sidonia, you're over the side. That's the way it went. If you're a poor Jewish schnook, you still go in the live column, not the dead column. Because even for poor Jewish schnooks, the Jews have this mishagas that they will pay. Now, the pirates might bargain hard with the local committees, might end up in Algeria or Morocco or in Constantinople, or if you're a Christian over here in the island of Malta, which was the headquarters of the Christian pirates, the committee over here used to have full-time non-Jewish agents. There was a family, Garçon, a French Catholic family, that they worked for the committee in Venice, and they were on their payroll, and their job was to haggle with the pirates every time some Jews get there. There was a synagogue there with Siddurim and everything like that. That was life. But we're talking about small numbers. Again, we're talking about a situation where a ship gets captured or sunk, and 5 Jews, 3 Jews over here. And so you can have a wonderful large community in Istanbul and Constantinople and Izmir and places like that to handle 5, 10, 20 people. Here come 10,000. Here come 20,000, 30,000. What do you do with that? And what they try to do is share it. They say, okay, we can't do all this money, but Venice has to give us some money, and these guys have to give money. And they sort of do for the first round, especially Salonika. But by the time you get to the second and the third round, there's no money there. And so what happens is a lot of these people either get killed or sold to slavery from Muslim families, or end up in who knows what. You see? And so you need mazel even in the slave markets, as it were. And that vastly complicates, as you can imagine, the halachic side of things, as well as being a gigantic human tragedy. Again, Bernie has the material on this. There's a guy, Adam Teller, Haifa, writes a lot about this. Let me come to the end. It's a big historiographical debate that Naftali mentioned, and I actually will not go into it a great deal because of time and other constraints. And that is, it goes as follows. Secular historians, this is a big, famous non-from idea, will say it as the following. And I don't agree with this, but I'll tell you what they say. And it makes sense, too. This was a traumatic experience. Everything I just read you was very traumatic. I know people here are still shuddering over what we talked about 2 weeks ago, and I understand that, because we're Americans, we're not used to this. So it was a terrible experience, and you can see it reflected in the writings. And so this left, the argument would be a psychological trauma on all the survivors, paralleling what we know in the Holocaust. And the result was, it left them all up to screwy ideas, and since they were still religious at that time and not secular, they were looking to make the case that if 1648 wasn't a Mashiach year, then some other year was going to be, and that's how Shabtai Tzvi came along, because the whole Shabtai Tzvi episode happened in 1665 and 1666. Guess what? The war between Russia and Poland didn't end until 1667. So the tail end of all this stuff was still going on at that time. Okay? And therefore the argument would be, this is Gershom Scholem and people like that, the argument would be that the messianism that arose out of Shabtai Tzvi was in response to the terrible traumas that happened in the Xeris Tachvatad and its aftermath. And this is the Jews looking desperately at straws, and here's a guy presenting himself as a Mashiach, and that's why they all jumped on it, and that's why the whole thing turned into a gigantic Chel Hashem, the big bubble that popped, because everybody believed in it, or a lot of people, including some big people, believed in it, and then it turned out to be false. But there's one basic problem with that thesis. There are several, but there's one biggie, and I think the geography reflects it. What am I talking about? Do you see where I'm going? If that's so, then Shabtai Tzvi should have popped up here. You get what I'm saying? What was happening to the Turkish Jew all this time? Nothing. They were having it good. If you lived in the 1650s, that's the place to be, not there. Right? This is the primary area where Sabbatianism popped up and eventually spread to other places, making some inroads, not many, not in the 1600s in here. In the 1700s they do, but not in the 1600s. And so, do you see the point? It's oversimplistic because it ignores the basic geographical evidence. The Jews in Poland do not develop any false messianic figures in the 1600s. After Shabtai Tzvi dies, then you get a few weirdos popping in Polish Jewry, but that's already too late. Now, this means that what the secular historians were trying to do was, I think, is transpose the 20th century experience onto the 17th. To say, look what happened to us after the Holocaust and all these traumas and things that we had, and we're looking for grasping at straws. And there is some truth to the thesis that would say that the state of Israel took the place, I don't mean this in a bad way either, the state of Israel took the place of a messianic kind of deliverance, so that I know when I was a kid, people used to say like this, okay, yeah, the Holocaust, but then you got Israel. That there's some kind of nechama in saying, okay, some kind of geula happened. I still remember, in fact, Rabbi Soloveitchik said that. So, you know, not that it's worth 6 million, but at least the aftermath of 1945 was 1948. So you're taking the same kind of model, I think, and transposing it on 1648 and saying, well, at least they had it. But it doesn't really quite work. It's been under attack by other historians, Moshe Adel and others, I mean some very serious people in the last 20 years, but that'll take us a little bit too more technical than we want to go to over here. Same thing has to do with Hasidism. It is a commonplace of the secular Jewish historiography that the Baal Shem Tov was born in around 1700, 1698 or so. Obviously, Hasidism represents an escapist kind of philosophy. This is how it goes. Why would that pop up in Poland this time? Oh, they're definitely coming off the Gzeres Tachvatat. Right? It's all the same piece. He is from Podolia, no question about that. He's from the place where all the massacres had taken place, but we find no real connection in Hasidus with Sabbatianism and other kinds of messianic kind of, in fact, quite the opposite. Hasidism is really associated with a kind of non-messianic, what they call quietistic approach, which is you just do the Torah mitzvahs, concentrating on your Dveikus now, and the Rebbeinu Shalom will bring the Mashiach whenever he does. Yeah? It's not a movement where the Baal Shem Tov says, no, let's all go to Israel or let's fight the Goyim or something like that. So, the classic old historiographical argument, in my opinion, doesn't hold. I will conclude by saying in general that as horrible as everything was in the Gzeres Tachvatat, perhaps the most fascinating part of all this is the Jews recovered fairly quickly. They did not have, as far as we can tell, the kind of traumas that we associated in the 20th century with the post-Holocaust. At least people didn't write that way if they had it. So we have no evidence of that whatsoever. It's also true that Poland took some very serious hits, and the Jews with them, but then Poland recovered. If you followed what I said last time, after the Peace of Andrusovo, I know it was after the late 1660s, or to be more exact, in 1672, they finally got a good king, John Sobieski, who really led the country in a major recovery. He didn't fix the problem. This was his great failure. He did not fix the machine. The Poles still had this politically retarded system of deliberate veto, where one guy can declare not only can declare the law not to be a law, in other words, it has to be unanimous, he can dissolve parliament. He could dissolve the Diet. He says, I don't like it. They even asked the guy, why did he do it? He said, I just want to see if I can do it. There were people like, Polish historians, believe me, bitterly look back upon this and their mistakes. So the problem was in the structure of the machinery. But I can tell you this much. By the time you get to 1700 or so, certainly 1710 or 1720, which is not that long after we're talking about, and arguably earlier, the Jewish control of the Polish economy reached its maximum. Isn't that what you think? If you went back to 1620, in the good old days, the Jews were conducting economic wars in Poland with other, ethnic mafias, right? Ethnic networks. It was the Jews versus the Germans, the French, the Armenians, the Greeks. You see? All kind of different networks that these guys are trying to control this side of the trade, or the fur trade, or the lumber business, or the bars, or the control of the wood, or whatever you want. By the time you get to, and the Poles are almost like passive in this. By the time you get to the 1720s, the other guys are out. The Jews undercut them all. Right? We're dealing with a tough community over here. We're dealing with Jews, as we saw, many of whom elected to move onto the frontier. They were wrong, but they elected to move on the frontier. These were Jews who could shoot back. These were Jews who were not slouches. They couldn't rise and revolt against Poland. They weren't interested in doing that. And they're totally under the control of the magnates. Nevertheless, within the range of the possible, the Jews, as I say before, it's a double you do. By the time you get to the 18th century, the Jews completely owned the economy of Poland under the control of the magnates, which means that the nobles own the control of the economy, and they make the line of the money, but the people who actually run the stores and do it are the Jews. It's just which set of Jews. The magnates play one group off against another, and this is something that they're always complaining about in this farm. So the religious outlook turned out to be, from a strictly utilitarian point of view, the most efficient in dealing with the tragedy, because at the end of the day, and here we are at Tisha B'Av, at the end, if we want to be perfectly honest, we have no choice, no one does, when these gezeras come, except to roll with the punch, and then to pick up your life as best you can. Those who survived the Holocaust in the 20th century, for example, my parents and some of your parents, what can you do about it? You can't go up and blow up Germany. You can't do it. You can't go and right all the wrongs. You can't do it, right? It would be nice if you could, but you can't. The only thing you could do was pick up the pieces, put them together, do the best you can, try to raise a family, try to get remarried and all these sorts of things, the reconstruction, and in that lies the only possible triumph.